Hello and welcome to a very quick tutorial on the periods of Greek history. It was originally the periods of Greek history and sources of evidence, but this is really just periods of history. This is a very fresh student introduction, if you will. So we're covering some real bare bones basic ideas that everyone needs to start with at the beginning of the semester, such as terminology. In our readings, we're going to run into labels for dates, and those labels are, as we see on the board here, the BCE or CE nomenclature, which is secular, and the BC or AD nomenclature, which has a bit of a religious bias. Generally speaking, sometime in the mid to late 20th century, scholars became more conscious of their cultural and religious biases living in a Western or heavily Judeo-Christian world. They dated things using the nomenclature of BC and AD. BC means before Christ, AD means in the year of our Lord, Anno Domini. And both of those points of reference are very particular to a Christian worldview. So the scholars got to thinking, there's a lot of Christianity in Western Europe and North America and maybe South America, but there are other peoples in the world too. So they decided upon this labeling system that changes very little except for the actual letters and what the letters represent. So, and I'm going to show you a timeline in a second, but earlier writers, for the past, 1,000 or more years, have been using BC for the periods of history before the zero on a timeline, and AD for years after the zero on a timeline. What scholars have done in the late 20th century is just replaced BC with BCE, and it's intentionally very similar in look, although it means before the Common Era, so there's no reference to one religious figure or another, and Common Era, again, no specific reference to religious biases. Alright, so how does that really play out? Let's take a look at our timeline here. In this timeline, time moves from right to left. Our earliest labeled point in time on our timeline is 2000 BCE. Now, as time moves forward in this BCE, notice that BCE and BC are exactly the same. Just as CE and AD are exactly the same as far as the numbers are concerned. So, as time moves forward from right to left, the numbers get smaller. This is 1000 BCE written over itself twice by accident, or 1100 and 1000. And then we get 480 BCE, and time keeps moving until it gets to the zero. Once the timeline gets to zero, instead of counting down, because zero is as low as you can count, we don't use negative integers in time, the time starts going up. So we get to 1000 CE. So whenever time moves forward and the numbers get bigger, it's the Common Era, also known as Anno Domini or AD. And when the numbers get smaller, we're in BC or BCE. So 1,000 years after zero, and then zero could be CE or BCE, it doesn't matter. But from zero, 1,000 years after zero is 1000 CE. 1,000 years before zero is 1000 BCE. Now we're living in, well, I wrote this in 2023. We're living in 2023, 2024. It's just a little bit past the 2000 CE. So we are living in the 21st century CE. Okay. So that's us a little bit further down the line from 2000 CE. Very different from 2000 BCE, which is about 4,000 years later, because it's 2,000 years to get to the zero, and then 2,000 years before the zero. So, long story short, as time progresses on the timeline from right to left, the numbers on the right side of the zero are BCE, and the numbers get smaller and smaller until they get to zero. At the 0 point, we transitioned from BCE, or BC, into CE, or AD. Your various readings are going to use either CE and BCE, or AD and BC. We're living in a time where modern writers will sometimes use AD BC, others will use CE BCE, whereas in the previous 2,000 years of Western civilization, they were always using AD and BC. What are our takeaways here? BCE and BC refer to the same times. It's just a different way of labeling those times, a different nomenclature. CE and AD are equal in time. They are, again, just different terms to attach to those numerical dates. BCE and BC dates get smaller as time moves forward. CE and AD dates get larger as time moves forward. In between CE and BCE is one single zero. BCE ends at a zero. CE starts at the zero. Okay. The Aegean. I'm going to show you. Let me just jump to the map. Here's a map of the Aegean Sea. This is the Greek peninsula, Macedonia up here, Thessaly, the Peloponnesus. This is mainland Greece with its Cycladic islands. Anatolia is also Asia Minor. Anatolia, that's modern-day Turkey. You can see the island of Rhodes, the large island of Crete. Okay, this is modern-day Greece here. But it also, the Greek world, the origins of the Greek world, are not just in what we think of as Greek today, or Greece today. The Aegean Sea is this big body of water in the northeastern Mediterranean that is framed by mainland Greece, the Greek peninsula on the west, the Asia Minor, or Turkey, on the east, and right up here is the entrance into the Black Sea. So the Aegean is this whole area. It's the massive water and the land and islands in and around it. The Aegean is where the Greek world originates from. Now, what we have here is a chronology of the Aegean, a list of the cultures that lived and dominated the Aegean, the dates that they were around, the writing system they used, it's called script, but it's the writing system, and the language that they spoke and wrote in. Now, in the late Bronze Age, the major civilizations were what we call the Cycladic, from about 3300 BCE to about 2000 BCE. We don't know if they wrote anything. We have no idea what language they spoke. But they are called Cycladic because they were based off of the islands called Cycladic Islands in the Aegean Sea. Later, between around 2000 BCE, still before that, but this is the high point, around 2000 BCE to about 1450 BCE, again, notice times get smaller, where the Aegean was dominated by Minoan civilization. The Minoans were based off of the great big island of Crete, and they asserted their dominance over all of the Aegean. That's these yellow areas here, not just where they were from on Crete. We do have a writing system that the Minoans use. We found it. It's called Linear A. There isn't a lot of it, so we don't really know what it says. There's not enough sample size to figure out the actual text. However, the people who followed the Minoans and lived beside them were the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans were at the height of their powers between 1600 and 1100 BC. The Mycenaeans originated from the mainland, so the Minoans are from Crete, the Cycladic peoples are from the Cyclades, and the Mycenaeans are from the mainland. And so they do all cross over and coexist with each other at some points. The Mycenaeans learned to write from the Minoans. That's why the script or the writing systems that they left behind is called Linear B, because it looks like it was clearly based off of Linear A. Now, what's interesting here is we can translate the Linear B tablets that were left behind, and we know that they actually spoke an early form of Greek. So the Mycenaeans, big takeaway, the Mycenaeans were the first definite Greek-speaking peoples in the Aegean. And they rose to power in the Aegean between 1600 and about 1450. By 1450, they displaced the Minoans, or they amalgamate with the Minoans, and the Mycenaeans basically dominate the Aegean for the next 400 to 500 years. So we have very definite Greek rule over the Aegean. The Mycenaean civilization fell apart. We don't know why. It's called the Dark Age of Greece. We don't know that they had any kind of writing. We don't think that they did. But we do know they were still speaking Greek. The Archaic period begins around 800 in the 700s. So from 800 to 700, we see huge population increases. We start to see a new script called the alphabet, the Greek alphabet, become used in the Greek world. So the Greeks created their own writing system based off of Phoenician systems. And of course, the language they're speaking is still Greek. Let me see here. The Archaic period ends at about 480 BCE when the Greeks repelled the Persian invasion. Classical period goes from about 480 to 323. Again, we have Greek alphabet, Greek speaking. The Hellenistic period follows that, Greek alphabet, Greek speaking. And then we get into the Republican, Roman, and Hellenistic era. This is one era, it just depends on where you are. But in this time, the Roman Republic is on the rise. At about 140, 150 BCE, Rome was the dominant power in the Aegean, or in the Mediterranean, and they were pushing their way into the Aegean. So we get a lot of mythological texts in both Greek and Latin in this period. Technically, from the Greek perspective, we're still in the Hellenistic period, but we're getting a lot of Greek and Roman authors. And then when Rome becomes an empire, 27 BCE, this is Caesar and Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar, really Augustus. We get the official Roman Empire, and everything becomes Imperial Roman as far as periodization is concerned. And once again, we are getting communication, texts, philosophy, everything, myths, in both Greek and in Latin, spoken, and Greek and Latin written. Okay, so again, we've seen the Aegean. Here's a look at the Mycenaean Aegean, and notice that the Mycenaeans had settlements all over mainland. They were mostly a mainland civilization first, but they did take over Crete and the Cyclades, and they didn't just exert influence over these places. They actually had settlements there, these little dots. So the early Greek world, the Mycenaean world, isn't just Greece. It's an Aegean world. A very brief look at some of the major architecture of the Minoans and Mycenaeans. On Crete, the Minoans were an island civilization, and their prolific, colossal architecture is represented best in their palace structures. This is a artist's reconstruction of the palace of Minos at Knossos. It's huge. And what is strikingly different between this palace and the palace structure of the Mycenaeans and Mycenae at mainland Greece is the absence of a perimeter wall. Why? Well, we no longer think that the Minoans were tree-hugging hippie Eden peace lovers who never had to deal with war or anything, but they were an island civilization, a seafaring civilization. Their walls were the seas and their ships that patrolled the seas. Okay, so you have to be careful looking at these things and making one-to-one correspondences. The Mycenaeans were originally a land civilization. They didn't have the Aegean seas and ships as a buffer zone between their citadels and threatening forces from the outside, so they built really big, thick walls. Okay, so that was a very light look at some of the differences in art and architecture between the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, and that's pretty much all we're going to do with them. What is most important to us are the dates, the scripts, and the languages that were spoken. In particular, note that the Mycenaeans were our very first definite official Greek speakers, our first Greeks. They learned their writing system from the Minoans. It is not the writing system we think of as Greek today. That wasn't invented until the Archaic period. They spoke Greek from the Mycenaean period on down, but it wasn't until the Archaic period that the Greeks invented their own alphabet. By the way, the term alphabet is the first two letters of the alphabet in Greek, alpha, beta. It's literally like calling the alphabet the ABCs. Right? A, B, C, D, E, F, G, alpha, beta. That's all alpha, beta means. A and B. The ABs. I'm choking on the water that I drank to moisten my throat. A couple of notes on the Dark Age. The Dark Ages came to an end, began to end around 800. Trade contacts with the Greek world, with the Greeks and Easterners, the Phoenicians, grew. The Homeric epics, the most famous and popular myths in the Greek world, were composed. I say composed, not written. They didn't write them. Were composed in the mid to late 8th century. In the mid to 8th century, for the next 150 years, down to the end of the 7th century, there is a massive explosion of Greek peoples and populations, and they leave the Aegean to colonize the entire Mediterranean world. The heaviest concentration of these Greek colonies is found in southern Italy and Sicily. I'll show you that in a second. And from an art history perspective, especially for our concerns, it's between 600 and 480 that the Greeks develop and start painting their stories, their myths, in black and red figure vases. So the painting between 600 and 480 BCE is a real treasure trove of mythological painting, and they still keep painting in red figure after 480. But the black figure stuff, especially, is the first examples of a lot of different stories to be told from Greek mythology in the visual arts. The classical period is defined by the Greeks finally defeating the Persians in the Persian Wars. The movie 300 was about this. The separation between the Hellenistic and classical worlds is marked by the death of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great and his father Philip II of Macedon, combined to put an end to the individual Greek city-states that thrived in the Archaic and Classical period. Those individual city-states became one or two or three or four giant Hellenistic kingdoms. So the city-states lost their independence under Philip and Alexander. Alexander brought the Greek way of thinking and speaking to the entire Mediterranean world, not so much to the Westerners, not so much to the Italian peninsula and west, but they were very focused on the east, because the east is where all the riches were, and they Hellenized or Greekified the east, the Near East, the Mesopotamian civilizations, the Persian holdings, even Egypt was Greekified by Hellenistic kings and princes and princesses like Cleopatra. Fun fact, the name Cleopatra, who we think of as being an Egyptian queen, is actually a Greek. She's a Ptolemy. But the name Cleopatra is a Greek name, not an Egyptian name. So, if you were to read a bunch of the Apollodorus stories that we're not reading very much of, but if you were to read some of these mythographers, or all of Herodotus, you would find that there are a lot of Cleopatras, right? Why? Because Cleopatra is a Greek name, not an Egyptian name. The Cleopatra of great fame to history is a Greek, from a Greek family, I should say, who had moved to Egypt, lived there, and ruled there for a few generations. So she would be like a third-generation Greek who moved to Egypt and kind of went native, adopted Egyptian ways of life, and mixed them with the Greeks. Periods of Greek art. This is different from the periods of history. Proto-geometric art describes the kind of art, and you're going to read more about this. Proto-geometric art began 1070, 1100, down through 900 BCE, until it becomes full-fledged geometric art for the next 200 years after that. Archaic art, 700 to 480 BCE, and you can see some descriptions of it. Orientalizing, black and red figure, those are signature archaic styles. The classical period, red figure painting, contrapposto sculpture, multi-depth, moving around, breaking away from the ground plane, and mural painting. That's all typical of classical artwork. Austere, stoic facial expressions, very classical. The Hellenistic period is defined in sculpture by extremes, extreme movement, extreme emotion represented in their sculpture, and a lot more moving around of the ground plane in their painting. And that's pretty much it. So we'll talk more about the period, the actual styles in other lectures, but this is a very generic overview of the date ranges for our basic styles: geometric, archaic, classical, and Hellenistic art. And you can see how that does and does not overlap with actual historical periods. Archaic, classical, and Hellenistic, they're all the same historical periods. And the geometric art takes place predominantly over the Dark Age historical period and the early Archaic period. Okay, last but not least, we already looked at the Aegean. Here is Italy and Sicily, where the Greeks especially colonized. They colonized Marseille, that's a Greek city. They colonized cities all the way up into the Black Sea, the modern-day Ukraine and Crimean Peninsula. They colonized cities in Cyprus. Alexandria in Egypt is a Greek colony. So the Greeks colonized Spain too. They colonized the entire Mediterranean. The Greeks in the Archaic and Classical period moved from an Aegean civilization to a Mediterranean civilization. And although they originate from the Aegean, you could be a native Greek and you could be living in a Greek city-state in Italy or Spain and still be a Greek. Also remember, every city-state is its own country, its own nationality, or its own national unity. So they consider themselves Greeks even if they didn't live in what we would call Greece today. As long as they were Greek and they lived in a Greek city-state, anybody born in that city-state would be considered Greek. If they spoke Greek, they shared the same Greek values. Which brings us to the definition of a Greek person. And this is where we're going to end the lecture today. There are two defining features for Greek people, and they are not related to where you live. They had to speak a dialect of Greek. They had to speak Greek natively. And they shared the same common literature and culture, the same gods, the same festivals, the same worldview. That was what made you Greek, not whether you lived in the Aegean or whether you lived on Italy or Sicily or in the Black Sea area, because there are Greek city-states in all of those places. If you were a native Greek, you could move from one Greek city-state to another, and while you may not have been a citizen in those polises, or polises, that's plural of polis, then you were at least allowed to live there and work there and make a healthy living. Okay, I hope that brief introduction to the history and timeline helped you orient yourself to the Greek world.